Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Abigail Belknap-Seidner. I'm the Executive Director of the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network here at NYU School of Law. We're so thrilled to have such a broad turnout today. We have everyone from attorneys at top law firms and nonprofits to current NYU law students, and I want to give a very special welcome to all the admitted students joining us today. We hope you'll join us at NYU this fall. A little background on the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network. The Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network is an academic center here at NYU Law within the law school. We were founded to serve as a hub for gender equity issues at the law school and to address the stark gender inequities that we continue to see in the legal profession. We also provide a forum to discuss how women's rights and sexism intersect with legal issues while developing innovative leadership training to prepare the next generation of lawyers to be authentic, effective, and inclusive leaders alongside their legal education. We encourage all admitted students today to attend NYU Law in the fall and join the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network for open leadership training programs and to apply for our intensive Women's Leadership Fellows program, which brings together a cohort of women and any students who are interested in women-focused leadership training to be committed to inclusive leadership in law school and beyond. Women have graduated from law school in roughly equal numbers to men for the past 20 years, and we were 40% of law school students since the 80s, and we're still not seeing those gains trickle up to the top corridors of power. Through events like today's symposium, the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network brings top thought leaders together to discuss why these problems persist, and more importantly, what can be done to fix them. Almost exactly 1 year ago, life as we knew it in the United States shut down. What began as a temporary pause quickly became a new way of life, juggling working from home and Zoom symposia alongside childcare, social isolation, and altering our worlds to stay safe from this deadly virus. The pandemic exposed enormous cracks in the American society, and we quickly became aware that most of these cracks had, for years, been filled by women. Underpaid teachers serving as caregivers and social workers as they educate students, mothers taking on the burden of constructing elaborate care structures for children and elders in the absence of comprehensive infrastructures of care. And of course, our essential healthcare workers, 76% of whom are women. The pandemic widened and deepened all of these cracks to chasms. We've been forced to realize that where other countries have social safety nets, the US has women. And America's already overstretched women can no longer stretch across these chasms. Last year, we saw vastly disproportionate numbers of women leaving the workforce. And while we're just now starting to see heartening numbers of women, and particularly mothers of school-age children, returning to work, even as the economy begins to recover, women of color continue to be hit the hardest. We cannot simply return to normal. Normal was already stretched to the breaking point. We must build back better than before. Luckily, the past year has given us incredible examples of women's resilience and innovation in the face of unprecedented obstacles. Women global leaders keeping their countries safe, a woman campaign manager running a nearly entirely virtual presidential campaign that led to the election of our first ever woman of color, Asian American, and African American vice president. We've seen organizers like Sister District embracing digital platforms, and the new Georgia Project achieving historic runoff wins in the Georgia Senate races. We've seen Supermajority and Emily's List galvanizing record numbers of women to the polls and beyond, and Representative Katie Porter with her whiteboard taking everyone to task and ensuring that COVID tests would be free for all Americans. Today, we are thrilled to bring so many of these extraordinary women together to discuss how we build on this momentum, to broaden and deepen our commitments and sustain our civic engagement to stay in the game, find where we can be most effective as leaders, and work together to build back better than we were before. In our first panel today, we'll hear from the boots on the ground, extraordinary public servants from a wide range of government and nonprofit roles, from local to federal, from agencies to state houses. All of them have been innovating in real time as this crisis evolved and deepened, and we're all looking forward to finally being at a point where we can focus on rebuilding better. What lessons have we learned in the past year? What silver linings might we want to keep? How can we make our next steps more equitable than how we lived a year ago? And how will we work together at all levels of society and government to make these changes last? At 2:45 p.m., our second panel will dive into the issue of how to make our political actions sustainable, why it's important not to rest on our laurels after a political win, how to deepen our commitments to civic action and work to find the forms of activism that feel right to us and feed us so that we can keep at them day after day, even in off years. Although you'll note, there may not be any actual off years. At 4 o'clock, we'll hear from an incredible public servant and former law professor who brings all of this together to serve as a prime example of being the leader you want to see in the world. US Representative Katie Porter, in conversation with our Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network Faculty Director, Professor Melissa Murray. We are so grateful to all of our panelists and moderators for joining us today. We also want to acknowledge the hard work of our co-sponsors for today's symposium, including our fellow law school center, the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law, its faculty directors, Professor Tony Thompson and Professor Deborah Archer, and Executive Director Vincent Sutherland, who you'll hear from before the second panel. I also want to give a very special thank you to the Journal of Legislation and Public Policy, especially the student editors, including the symposium editors, Ariane Connell and Jennifer Thompson, the intellectual life editors, Amanda Gavkovich and Naomi Wasson, and the editor-in-chief, Chris Shenton, who you'll hear from before the keynote. All of them have been instrumental in planning today's events and the writing competition, which we'll announce the winners of later today. I'd also like to thank Joe Rivera, our media production specialist, who's helping everything run smoothly today. And finally, we are very grateful for everyone at the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network, our faculty director, Professor Melissa Murray, our founding supporters, Sheila Birnbaum and Sarah Moss, our student researchers, Mia Brill and Lola Charles, and of course, our assistant director, Claire Whitman, who helps make all of our events possible and will be announcing the CLE codes throughout the day. So on that note, we have a few logistics before we get started. For those seeking New York State CLE credit for this event, please record all of the CLE attendance verification codes that will be announced throughout the program. Following the program, attendees will receive an email link to an attorney affirmation and evaluation form. To earn credit, attendees seeking CLE will need to fill out the form and enter all CLE codes that are announced during the symposium. We will not be announcing codes during the breaks, so you can safely leave your screen to stretch your legs. We will have time for questions during each of today's panels and the keynote conversation, so please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit all of your questions throughout the day, and we'll get to as many as we can with each panel and during the keynote. Thank you so much to all of our attendees. We hope you enjoy the symposium. Now I am honored to introduce our first moderator, Professor Sylvia Law. Professor Law is the Elizabeth K. Dollard Professor of Law, Medicine, and Psychiatry Emerita at NYU School of Law. For more than 4 decades, she has been one of the nation's leading scholars in health law, gender justice, poverty, and constitutional law. She is the co-director of the Arthur Garfield Hays Program and chair of the Rose Scheinberg Lecture Program at NYU School of Law. You can find her full biography, as well as those of our panelists, on our symposium program page, which we'll put the link in the chat. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Professor Law to get us started. Thank you again.
Hi, I'm Sylvia Law, as you've just heard. I've been at NYU Law since 1965. Can you hear me? Good. First as a student, then as a practitioner and as an adjunct professor, and since 1973 as a professor now emerita. Sheila Birnbaum was one of my best mentors as a young teacher. She's legendary as a lawyer and created this visionary program. As a student and as a young lawyer, my major client was a group called the National Welfare Rights Organization. Those women challenged the denigration of women, both as wage workers and as caretakers of the young and the old. We protested disparities in wealth, income, and human opportunity. In the past half century, women have made great strides. Explicit gender discrimination is illegal and socially unacceptable. Still, racial and gender discrimination and inequality persist, both in the marketplace and most acutely in the valuation of caretaking work. Women, though more educated than men, still earn 20% less than men do, and the racial wage gap is even worse at 31%. Disparities in income were distressing to us in 1973. They've grown from 1973, when the average CEO earned 20 times as much as the average worker, and that seemed unfair. By 2013, the gap was 296 times more. The pandemic has exposed and exacerbated the holes in the social safety net and persistent inequality. But crisis always opens opportunities. Our task today is to explore and seize this moment. We have a stunning panel from the highest levels of public policy, from Congress, from the state of California, and from New York City. I would love to introduce all these people, but we decided that it would be better for all of us for them to introduce themselves. So we'll begin with Melissa.
Hi, Melissa Boteach, Vice President of Income Security and Childcare Early Learning at the National Women's Law Center.
Maribel?
Yes, hi everybody. My name is Maribel Hernandez Rivera, and I am a proud NYU Law graduate. I graduated in 2010. I did both a JD and PA. I also, I heard mention of so many of the people who got me through law school. So I hear that there's a lot of prospective students right now listening to this. I have to tell you, I loved, and I'm glad I went to NYU. Tony Thompson being one of my mentors. I did the Immigrant Rights Justice Clinic, the Latinx Rights Scholarship. All this to say that I am glad to be back with my alma mater. I should let you know I am not an expert in women's rights. What I've been dedicating my life to is immigrant rights. But as we will hear as we talk about different questions, the interconnectivity between what it means to be a woman and then an immigrant woman and a woman of color, there's so many layers there that I'll be happy to talk about that.
Anne O'Leary.
Thank you, Professor Law. Let me first start by just saying thank you to you. I've read your academic work for many years, been inspired by it, and really so grateful to be on a panel with you. I'm Ann O'Leary. I have, until very recently, was the Chief of Staff to Governor Gavin Newsom for the last 2 years. I finished that service in January and have come home to just do some little recovery work with my children who, I think it's been a really tough time, and I know we're going to talk about it for everybody, women at all levels. And I think, being a woman kind of at the highest level of service and having school-age children, I was actually the first chief of staff to ever have school-age children in California, and it sure was a heck of a time to do it. So I'm just taking a little time to recover before I throw myself back into the next venture. But I spent much of my career working on the care economy, writing, thinking, talking about paid family leave, about paid sick days, advocating and trying to make progress wherever I find myself. So I really look forward to talking about those issues today.
Thank you, thank you. And finally, last but not least, Brittany Saunders from New York City.
Thank you, Sylvia. My name is Brittany Saunders. I am Deputy Commissioner for Strategic Initiatives at the New York City Commission on Human Rights. We're an agency that enforces and educates, enforces the city's human rights law and educates New Yorkers about their rights and obligations under that law. I've been at the commission for about 4 years now, maybe 5, and have worked on issues related to racial justice, the intersection between human rights and emerging technologies, and a range of other issues. Before that, I worked in the mayor's office, in the office of the mayor's council, and before that at a couple different advocacy organizations. So first at the Center for Social Inclusion, and then after that with the Center for Popular Democracy. So I'm really excited to be here today and to talk about some of our relevant work in this space.
So let's kick this off by asking each of our panelists, or whoever wants to address this, how has the pandemic exacerbated existing gender inequality? We know it was bad before. We think it's worse now, but be concrete. How do you see that playing out? Who would like to start?
I'm happy to take a first stab. So I think, as noted in the introduction to this, women were already at a place of extreme inequality and precarity before the pandemic hit. The status quo had left us with, lower wages. 2/3 of women and 2/3 of people in low paid jobs are women, disproportionately women of color and immigrant women. And the social safety net that we have in place is, besides being actually women in terms of providing care work, the actual formal social safety net we had in place was filled with holes, riddled with all kinds of holes that are grounded in a history of racism and sexism and assuming who is deserving and who is not deserving. And so when COVID hit, it laid bare and exacerbated those inequities in a way that will, unless we are intentional about recovering with gender and racial equity at the center, will only get worse. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So women have been on the front lines of the COVID-19 crisis as essential workers. They are 3/4 of healthcare workers, 2/3 of grocery workers, over 90% of childcare workers. And so the lack of labor protections and safety for women on the front lines has been one way in which women have been more likely to be at risk during COVID-19. Secondly, Dr. C. Nicole Mason has dubbed this the she session because the jobs that have been lost during this pandemic have so heavily fallen in industries where women predominate: retail, restaurants, hospitality, childcare. And so you have seen women's unemployment numbers really much higher than men's. The third is the unpaid care burdens during the past year. And so for one example, just building off of what Ann was sharing personally, 4 times as many women as men left the labor market in September with the return to distance learning. 4 times as many women as men. And then all of the jobs that were lost in December on net were women's jobs, and actually women of color's jobs. And so this pandemic on those three fronts, women as frontline workers, women as people who've lost their jobs, and women as shouldering the disproportionate burden of unpaid caregiving, have really hit women hardest, and women of color most of all. And I think that's sort of the three big ways I would note at the top line level.
So does anyone want to add to that, or we could turn to an even more challenging question, which is, are there silver linings in the pandemic? Silver linings for gender inequality?
So I would jump in just to add a little bit to some of what Melissa shared before we get to the silver linings question. I mean, I think just first to kind of surface that in addition to the pandemic, some of the other like layered crises that folks are dealing with are really intensifying the situation for workers across the board. So you have people who are dealing with the risk of eviction, folks who are dealing with the impacts of structural racism and the kind of uprisings we had this summer in support of racial justice and the impacts on that and their families. Folks who are dealing with new fears around the effect of anti-Asian violence on their families or on their elders, and folks who are struggling with the a contested election with some of the highest stakes we could have ever imagined, and also a white nationalist insurrection just months ago. So just to like illustrate how all of those things, I think any one of those things could have been life-changing for any one of us or the folks who are listening or other folks out there, but taken together, I think it just emphasizes the kind of tremendous weight that everyone is carrying. And I think as Melissa laid out, there have been really dramatic impacts in terms of job loss for women, as well as women of color in particular. And then also the challenges around essential workers and those being fields in which women of color are often overrepresented and also exposed to COVID, often do not have the protections that they need, and also sometimes will confront harassment or discrimination, either because it's fallen to them to enforce things like mask protections, right? And then they're then being subjected to threats or harassment and violence. Or because they're being confronted with racial slurs or various different forms of sexual harassment. And then the final thing I would just add here is the way in which these crises have really, I think, underscored the challenges facing workers with caregiving responsibilities in particular. So obviously, caregiver discrimination is a challenge that's been around for a long time. But with all the burdens that folks are carrying, it's really, I think, an important area of focus moving forward.
Thanks.
Could I just add one piece just to highlight? I think one of the things that is so critical to, as we delve into talking about the safety net, is to recognize that America's entire safety net and social insurance was built on the notion that the first line of defense is the family. And the first line of defense is the family, with the woman assumed not to be able to drop whatever she is doing to be able to provide care. And unfortunately, that continues to be the way in which we are structurally set up. And so I think that one of the things that we have to recognize that the safety net really doesn't work or exist. It was never updated to ensure that we actually had a safety net with regard to the fact that families cannot provide that care because so many women are in fact working. And the other thing I would just say is that I think that the other thing that's really been in some sense both exacerbated, I think we as women are talking about it, but just how much invisibility there is. And so I think about domestic workers who were laid off, mostly women of color, laid off in droves by wealthy women and families who had gone home and no longer needed the housekeeper and the nanny. I think about the farm workers in California who didn't have a safety net because many of them are in this country without documentation. And so there was no safety net for those. And so we in California, raised philanthropic dollars to provide assistance, but it just can't be enough in terms of government. And then the final point that I'd make in terms of something that has been exacerbated that I think is very little talked about is the emotional work that women do. And I'd say that one of the things that was most striking to me was a Zoom call that I did did when I was the chief of staff to the governor with nurses and doctors. It happened to be all women. It wasn't intended that way, but when we set up the Zoom, it was all women who got on. They were at the front lines of treating COVID patients. And what was so interesting to me was how many of them talked about what it was like to be the last person that their patients saw because the families weren't there, and what women took on, extra things that they were doing to make sure that they were allowing people to leave with grace and dignity. And I think about the emotional work I did as chief of staff at the governor, supporting my team, making sure people had felt valued and heard, and we're dealing with caregiving. And I think it becomes, in some sense, something that women really take on, and they're doing it at work and at home, and it's exhausting. And I think part of it is like, how do we call that out, and how do we call out the mental health needs? So I'll leave it there.
And
Thank
I'll
you
add
so
one
much.
more piece
Yes.
to what Anne said, just from the perspective of undocumented immigrant women. You know, we saw, for example, undocumented immigrants do not have access to healthcare. They were not included in Obamacare. They continue to not be included anywhere. And we saw healthcare is something that affects all of us, right? So if one undocumented worker gets COVID, well, everybody else is at risk. And so to this idea of all the people who were already excluded before this pandemic happened, and then sadly continue to be excluded. So when we saw the different relief packages happening and undocumented immigrants continuing to be excluded, that's something to think about. The other thing from a personal perspective, and I should say I'm speaking in my personal capacity, not my professional capacity, not representing my office, but for me, I live in this weird world where on the one hand, I am a professional that working for Congress, and so I get to benefit from remote work. I get to benefit from healthcare. I get to benefit from all these things. On the other hand, a lot of my family are immigrants. Some of them are domestic workers. Some of them don't have status. And so to see this sharp contrast there is, so I am currently in Texas because I came here because my mom lives here. My stepfather was 88 years old and he passed of COVID. And it was pretty traumatic. And yet at the same time, I had the opportunity to come to Houston, to be with my family. I'm with my mother and, you know, taking care of her, but I have that privilege. There's so many other people, and in this case, I talk about undocumented immigrant women, but this happens to many other people who are disadvantaged, who don't have that possibility. I know a lot of people who got sick, and they said, I still have to go to work. And so to not have that availability to have medical leave, to not have availability to have unpaid leave, or to even be afraid that you're going to lose your job. And then, as Brittany mentioned, all the consequences that brings, no housing, not being able to pay for your livelihood. So all of that gets exacerbated when you're not only a woman, but then there's so many layers that are on top of that, and you just don't really know how to get out of it.
Thank you. That's so moving. I'm going to push us to move forward because the problems are profound. But we also want to try to figure out how to answer the questions that it raises. So what temporary solutions have been developed that we might want to keep as we move forward? And I think Maribel's last point about remoteness is a rich area for that. But are there others? Have we learned things from the pandemic that we want to fight to preserve?
If I can start, one of the, I'll combine it with your silver linings question, which is, I do think, for years there's been work on the fact that we need paid sick days and we need paid family leave and we need flexibility with support. And I do think that, I remember being absolutely astounded when I saw Congress very early on in one of the early relief packages coming forward and saying that they were going to provide paid family leave on paid sick days, on a bipartisan basis from Congress. That was not only unprecedented, but it was something that so many of us have fought for years and years to allow to happen. I also have been, struck by employers who are standing up and doing the right thing by their workers with regard to providing extra assistance on childcare and extra supports for workers who are working at home. One of the things that was recommended to me, and so I don't want to take credit, it's actually something that came out of SEIU, but I thought it was a really good idea, is that we in some sense need to do an after action report, which is a kind of term that we used in disaster response to look at what happened afterwards. But we need to do an after action response related to care. How did we do with regard to our frontline workers who were working in our nursing homes, who were providing in-home care? How did it go well? How did we fail them? How did we do with regard to parents who were providing care at home? What went well, what didn't? And I think that the good news is that there are solutions out there that already are embedded, but I do think that we need to have a hard look so that we can make sure we get it right.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Do you want to go, Britt? I see, were you about to unmute? Go ahead. Oh, yeah, okay. So I would say, just building off of what Anne said, part of what I think both silver lining and solution to this just really traumatic year is people seeing care as infrastructure for the first time. I mean, a lot of us have been saying this for a really long time, that care is the work that makes all other work possible. It is a core part of what connects people, of what strengthens our communities. It is a public good in the way that roads and bridges are, in the way that K through 12 public schools are. But I don't think people understood it viscerally until you are trying to figure out how to oversee distance learning while working full time, or while you were trying to take care of your mother or your uncle who has COVID at the same time as you're being called into an essential job. It is a different visceral level of understanding that people have now that we have an opportunity to lean into to make structural change. And I would say that's true on the care front. It's also true on the front of unemployed workers. The big conversation going on as we speak right now in the Senate is about this American Rescue Plan. And one of the things that's being discussed is an extension of unemployment insurance benefits. And one of the things I know that has been a topic of much conversation at the beginning of this pandemic was the extra $600 that was put on top of unemployment benefits for people, including people who are gig workers or who had previously been excluded from unemployment protections. I think that as we move forward, we've seen the gig economy conversation, which again, disproportionately people of color, disproportionately women who are left without these basic labor protections. For the first time, we got unemployment benefits for them, and it worked. It was hard for people to call in and get in, but it helped stabilize families. It helped prevent foreclosure. It helped make sure that the economic loss was mitigated more, but from a macroeconomic standpoint, it worked. And so I think that part of what we need to do is look at how well those unemployment insurance benefits worked. And then going forward from there, how do we make sure we're covering more people with social insurance and not trying to put up as many barriers as possible, whether they're administrative barriers, whether they are funding barriers, whether they're work reporting requirements that are designed to exclude people. How do we actually make it easier for people to get help?
I think that's right. And I think the thing that I would kind of add on that point, specific to the point that I raised before about workers with caregiving responsibilities, is that, I think what we've seen, as Melissa said, that you can find ways to recognize all the care work that people provide and to address those needs without the entire system collapsing. We've seen a lot of flexibility and innovation. So I think what I would say on that front is that, there are a lot of, or rather, there's very limited protection for folks with caregiving responsibilities at the federal level. Some states and localities have stepped in to kind of fill that gap. Here in New York City, we're lucky that under the New York City human rights law, there are protections for caregivers, meaning that, you cannot make decisions around, or rather, cannot discriminate against workers with caregiving responsibilities when it comes to hiring or promotion or other employment actions, simply because they have those responsibilities of taking care of children or older adults in their families, or family members who may have disabilities, and those sorts of things. But there's a limit to that, at least as the law currently stands, because there's no requirement to provide accommodations for those kinds of caregiving responsibilities. And so I think one thing that we could kind of push to do with this body of knowledge and experience that we now have is to kind of push for those accommodations, right? Now that we know that in many settings it is possible to make those sorts of arrangements. And whether that happens as a result of new legislation or whether it happens because employers kind of recognize that these things are now possible, I think it's incredibly important. I think the other thing that I would say as a kind of silver linings or lessons that I hope that we take forward is like, one, this new and improved understanding of, the workers in our economy who are essential, right? And the value that they provide for all of us and who they are and the protections that they need. And I think also, one of the most striking things for me kind of watching the conversation over the last year was the number of places where, we heard folks from the Disability Justice community who would note that or contrast rather the kind of innovation and flexibility that you're seeing in a lot of workplaces now or in other settings now with the kind of inflexible responses to demands and requests that they had been making before. And I think that there is a lot to be learned from that. And perhaps the kind of chief lesson of that is like the importance of listening, right? Because there's a lot of benefit that we all can gain when we listen and we think carefully and creatively and thoughtfully about solutions.
So because time is short, I'm going to ask us to shift to the broader question of what's your most visionary goal to rebuild better? I mean, I think these wonky, detailed things that we should keep and studies that we should do are so important. But what's your big picture vision of how we come out of this better than we were, and we weren't good when we went into it? Who wants to take a crack at that big question?
Maribel, are you trying to get on?
Maribel, I'd love to hear from you.
I think her audio is not connected yet.
Maybe it's happening.
Okay, so somebody else is going to have to try.
Yeah, I'll say a few words and then turn it back over. But, I think if you look at the history of the United States, after World War II, we actually did this really huge push through something called the Lanham Act to create child care centers all over the United States. And then as women actually went back home after the men came back from the war, we closed those child care centers down, never to really be rebuilt. And then, in the 1970s, when Nixon was president, we actually had a universal child care bill that passed through Congress. And Nixon vetoed it, worried that it was going to have implications that would ruin families because it would actually mean more women into the work, and that wasn't what Nixon thought should happen. So I think if you look at what we need to do now, it's exactly kind of what Melissa said, which is we need to make real this notion that we need a care infrastructure, and that is, state-of-the-art child care centers all over the country. It's improving our nursing home and skilled nursing facilities for elder care. It's making sure that we allow Medicaid to really be used in ways that allow seniors and people with disabilities to stay in their communities, but be supported. So I think that there's major investments. And, the good news is that President Biden probably has the most forceful care economy. And I say that as somebody who had worked on Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, and we had a strong care economy package ourselves, but he took it even further and really has said we need to make massive investments in childcare. We need to make sure that we make paid family leave permanent, that we made paid sick days permanent. I think that's a great start. And I think we need to, go even further. I think if you think about what's happening right now with our, brothers and sisters who are talking about climate change, everything is about the green infrastructure and what we need to do and green jobs that will be created. Well, the good news is that, care jobs are not jobs that can be exported. They're jobs that are here in America, and they're being done every day by women, often women of color. And we need to invest in those women, and we need to make sure they're no longer invisible. Today in the Senate, they're debating the $15 minimum wage. Well, 2/3 of minimum wage earners are women. And we don't say that out loud enough. But part of this is that we need to have an aggressive agenda to improve the working conditions in the care economy and to build out the infrastructure.
So just pushing back, that's a wonderful point, but just pushing back on it a little bit. the bipartisan assumption in Congress seems to be that we're passing a one-time only emergency COVID relief bill.
Well, I think what Biden has been clear about, and this is really important, is that there's two phases to this. There's a relief bill, which is what we're talking about right now. How do we provide immediate relief in economic stimulus? But then there's going to be a recovery package. And it will be essential in that recovery package that it's, as we think about infrastructure and we think about, investing in climate jobs and so on and so forth, that recovery package has to be a package that is looking at an equitable economic growth that has care economy as a very big pillar of the recovery package. So yes, this is going to be a two-step dance, and yes, it's going to be hard, but I think we need to make sure that, the relief is followed by the recovery piece.
Anyone else want to chime in here?
Maribel, you're on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. I wanted to add a little bit to the previous question, but then also to this question, because I think Brittany mentioned the essential workers. And that's one of the silver linings, right? So everybody cheered at 7 p.m., essential workers, great, but that's not enough. Like, cheering for essential workers is not enough, So we understand how important they are, and that's why we call them essential workers. Well, if that's the case, we need to give them protections. And that's not what we're doing yet. We still, even though we cheer on them, we haven't been able to provide them the protections that they need. I think about, for example, farm workers, and you mentioned farm workers. It took a while to prioritize them for the vaccine, when we knew that the reason why we were getting food was because they had been day in and day out every single day during this pandemic working. So the silver lining is that we recognize them in title, but the extra work that it is that we now need to recognize them with the benefits that they need. And also the other silver lining that I would say is that we have understood the interconnectivity of all of us, regardless of where we are in the social ladder. And so if that's the case, we need to make sure that, we mentioned before working remotely, well, that's not something possible for everybody. So we really need to think about the different sectors of the economy and how can we protect them? How can we give them the tools that they need to be able to thrive? And usually we don't. And so when I think about, for example, as we're talking about the care packages, et cetera, we are usually very easy to say, let's give money to the CEOs because that's good for the economy. But when it comes down, and we're seeing it right now, when it comes down to like $15 minimum wage, oh no, that's too much. Or when it comes down to payments because of the pandemic, oh no, that's too much. There is a troublesome line that we're making there that makes no sense in terms of like the practicality of it. It makes no sense in terms of, you're not really helping everybody, and that doesn't help the nation. But for some reason, we're not able to see that. And so I'm hoping that this pandemic allows us to see that it is just as it is important to help Wall Street, it might even be more important, actually, I would say it is more important to help the essential workers and the people who are allowing us to continue.
So, hell yeah, first of all, that's my that's my main comment. But I think that you actually touched on a really important point about the recovery, which is it's both about improving the quality of life, but it's also about attacking inequality writ large. Because what we're seeing is this K-shaped recovery where Main Street is falling further and further behind, while the stock market, which by the way is not the economy, is continuing to grow. And you're seeing that widening chasm as was described in the opening. And so I think that as we're talking about what recovery looks like, Anne spoke to a lot of what I would parrot in terms of the care infrastructure, in terms of childcare, paid family and medical leave, long-term services and supports, home and community-based care. But I also want to tax the patriarchy. I want to tax the rich. And I think that is important, not as a punishment for anybody. It's important both because revenues support these kinds of collective public investments. And it's important because our tax code is a social document the same way that our budget is. And so when you look at budget and you look at the spending priorities, you can tell what's important and what's not. The tax code shapes and incents certain behaviors
And it also disincents other behaviors. It values certain kinds of work and it devalues certain kinds of work. We did a whole study on tax justice as gender justice last year at NWLC. And so I think one of the things we really need to be looking as we're rebuilding going forward is addressing inequality. Again, taxes are not a punishment. They're a way that we support public investments that we need for everyone to thrive. And that is, I think, an important pillar of the conversation going forward, including tax credits like the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit, which are key sources of income support for women and women of color, and which also are really important for children's health, education, and long-term outcomes.
So Melissa and Maribel, I want to say hell yeah to both of your points. I think that's absolutely key. But it doesn't seem to be part of the conversation, and I could be wrong about this. Maybe I just am not listening in the right places, but how do we make that part of the conversation?
Well,
or others might want to respond.
Yeah, I was going to say,
because
one of the things
it
that
might
was so
be that question, the question of income inequality is an unhelpful distraction at this moment, that we want support for the care economy, but we're not willing to take on the bigger question of the profound inequality of opportunity across the board.
Yeah, one of the things that was striking to me just when I was working as a chief of staff is, something, Maribel, that you said is, first you have to make real the problem and show the problem. So I'll just give an example with regard to COVID, is that I insisted from the beginning that that the governor and myself and the senior leadership team was provided daily data on the racial and ethnic breakdown of who was getting COVID and who was dying from COVID and where the testing deserts were, and so that we could really understand what was happening. I think one of the challenges, however, is that how do you act upon that? How do you act upon that when you have a scarcity of resources? In the point that we were in was just an absolute scarcity. We didn't have backing from the federal government, obviously, during the Trump administration, so we weren't getting PPE. As vaccines were developed, the supply of vaccines obviously very limited. So I think part of it is that then when it comes forth, how do you make sure? In fact, actually, Governor Newsom just I think yesterday made a very bold move to say that they're really going to try to change their vaccine distribution so it's going to the most impacted communities who are hardest hit by COVID. So I think part of it is that you have to show that there's inequalities. You have to have the data as a policymaker, but then you have to really act on it and you have to redirect resources to it. And that, as Maribel was talking about farm workers, it took some time to do that and to do it right. So I think intentionality, I'll let others talk about, the hard lift we need to do on income equality, but I think on all of these pieces, whether it's racial inequities or income inequities, part of it is understanding it, but not simply resting on the data being enough. The data is not enough. You then have to act on it.
And I will just say, I've actually had the experience of these issues moving more to the center of the public debate. You can see through some of the folks that President Biden has appointed to various economic positions, that economists who have long focused on inequality and how it hampers growth, how it's connected to racial and gender inequality, are getting increasingly in positions of power and in positions of public, of having the bully pulpit. And that's not to say that we still are talking about care infrastructure and the care economy, because we want to be talking about a solution that is actually going to advance gender and racial equity, and also make our whole economy stronger. But again, I don't talk about inequality as a way to say that, rich people are bad or anything like that. The idea is that we all do better when we all do better. And the roads and the bridges and the care and all the other infrastructure that holds up our economy is benefiting those at the top. And we need to make sure that they're paying their fair share.
And I would just offer, I mean, less at the level of policy and more at the level of like to this question about, what can we do as like concrete steps depending on where we are positioned. And it occurs to me that there's a real opportunity for solidarity here. And, I feel like we've seen kind of, more and more interest, for folks who saw the uprisings in support of racial justice over the summer and are asking themselves, what can I do? Or folks who, were kind of struck by the disparities in terms of who was, dying from COVID or hospitalized or exposed because of the work that they were doing and were asking, what can I do? I think so many folks carved out time over the last year as they were able to do things like volunteering or letter writing or whatever it might be in order to impact the election. And so I guess I would suggest just concretely, like try to kind of preserve that space, keep that energy, figure out, whose leadership you might follow in these spaces. There are lots of women of color led organizations, and certainly I think as we've seen today, so many women leaders and leaders of color who are doing tremendous work in all of these spaces. Figure out how you can direct that time and that energy and that financial support as you're able to kind of support that work in a sustainable kind of long-term fashion, so we can see some of these legislative or policy changes or even cultural changes, which are also quite important.
Yeah, Professor Locke, to your point, I would say that some people are talking about it all the time. I know my boss, that's all she talks about, right? She's been talking about how inequality is really the root cause of what we're seeing. And so I know we have prospective students on this. We have current students listening to this panel. What I would say is this is why it's important to have people with life experience at those decision tables, because you can bring it up. Why can she bring it up? She worked as a waitress. She has experience and she sees it in her community. She knows what it means for, in real life purposes. So I would say to you students who are right now thinking about what you might want to be able to do, there's so many places in which you can come in, but we need you at the table because we need you to bring your experience so that when decisions are being made, people understand the actual effect of those decisions.
Maribel, I think that's a very important point to make to students, because it's not just the public interest, feminists, racial equality students. We need the tax people and the corporate people and the people who understand how the system works, because it's a whole system that we're dealing with, and you need technical expertise to do that. So we are open to questions from the audience, but we just got one. How do we help improve the pipeline for advancement of women in law firms? Firm culture refuses to promote women for fear that they will have children and raise kids. Well, that's a question that hasn't been solved. I'm not sure how it relates to the pandemic, but anybody want to comment on that?
Yeah, I was a law partner at Boies Schiller Flexner for several years before coming back into public service. And, one of the things that really surprised me when I got to the law firm, I, worked for Hillary Clinton for many years, worked on gender equity. And I started at the firm, and all these women associates came up, and I was a partner and said, "Oh my gosh, we're so glad you're here." And it was just surprising how few women partners there were, and even fewer women equity partners who had a financial interest in the whole endeavor. And so I think that one of the things that's important is, we have a very serious pipeline. We don't have a problem of women getting law firm jobs as associates. We obviously are not oversubscribed, but we are doing really well in terms of women going to law school, getting into the firms. But I think we are having a very bad problem with the intentionality of the firm leadership, mentoring, supporting, growing, and making sure that the women can not only be there, but continue to thrive. So I think a couple of things, help. One is, one of the things that's happening now is that, law firms are intentionally trying to make sure that women come in laterally, from a lateral perspective, so they could go into government service and then come back into the firm and be a leader in the firm, which I think is helpful. But I also think it's helpful that, clients are insisting now on diversity by all metrics. And so you're seeing corporate clients basically saying, don't bring me a team of litigators, don't bring me an advice and counsel team that doesn't have women and people of color on it. And so as a result, the firms are feeling more pressure than they've ever felt to actually be responsible because, for years, it didn't matter to their bottom line. The women were disposable associates and they could let them leave. And that's no longer the case. Not to be totally pessimistic, but it is driven by money. So I think that is helping, but certainly a lot more work to do.
And can I
Just on a personal, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
On a personal note, I just would like to say, Sheila Birnbaum is our best role model of somebody who bridges social justice and kick-ass corporate lawyering. So read her biographies or read news stories about her. She's awesome. Go ahead, Melissa.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think this actually can be bridged back to some of the things that have become more clear during COVID. Because mothers of young children had to reduce their hours or cut 4 to 5 times the rate of men during this time. And so a lot of that is better policies, but it's also about culture shifts. It's about talking about more equitable division of household labor. It's about making sure that our laws are set up to support that so that men are also taking leave and men are also capitalizing on the supports that we make available. Because if we pass paid family leave, but only women take it, that's not the end goal. We want care to be something that is that all people can have access to and don't feel a cultural barrier to accessing care supports when they need it. And so I think there's also a broader culture shift issue that applies to law firms, but is more broadly, there's an opportunity to lean into it during COVID.
I think we have to wrap up. I think we have to wrap up. And Claire needs to provide some message about CLE credit.
Yes. Hello, everybody. I am just going to, before we continue with the Q&A, announce the CLE code. As mentioned, please make note of this code so that when you receive the evaluation for this panel, you are able to write it down. The code is POL38. That is P as in Peter, O as in Oscar, L as in leadership, 38. POL38. And now I will turn it back to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. So here's a question. How can these policies be reframed to counteract right-wing conservative media? They have been so successful in preventing pay equality and other female-friendly legislation. And that list could go on and on. But how can we make our voices, I find your voices wonderful, but how do we counteract the voices that would be skeptical? Anyone want to volunteer for this one?
I feel like I've been talking a lot, so I want to see first if anyone else wants to speak.
Melissa, go for it.
Well, I think that potentially others will have something to add to this, which is sharing our stories. I think that one of the things that I have learned over the course of my life experience and career is that you don't get transformative social change without social movements that are led by the people who are most directly affected. And so I think, yes, it is important to neutralize messaging and to push back, point for point, but the goal is never going to be to convince the right wing to adopt, an agenda that centers gender and racial equity. I think that you have to build the base to carry that message that then convinces the middle. And that's how you're going to get change. And so we need to be making those investments in base building and in movement building, so that the voices and the experiences of the people who have been most directly affected by this care crisis, by pay inequities, by discrimination, by harassment, that their voices are loud and clear and front and center. And those stories and the organizing and door knocking that goes along with them changes hearts and minds. And I would say Fight to 15 is a perfect example of something that 10 years ago, people, when we said $15 minimum wage, we would have been laughed out of the room. And now you have many states and cities that have adopted it. Voters supported it in Florida, which went for Trump. It's a mainstay of the Democratic policy platform. And it has moved to the center from the margins because of the workers putting their lives and income on the line to fight for it. And so I think we have to broaden the conception of narrative change, not that this is what the questioner is implying, but away from talking points into movement building and narrative shifts.
Abby Seidner, would you like to answer this question too?
No, I'm just managing the Q&A box, so we're done with that question. But
okay.
I do have a question of my own, though, if it's okay to chime in myself. How can individual citizens help support their elected officials in pushing for these policies?
I can tell you that calling, emailing, talking, it works, specifically to the people who represent you. Okay, so that's really important. So if you live in California, figure out who your local leaders are, figure out who your representatives are, figure out who your senators are. They will listen to you because you are their constituent. They depend on your vote. That might not be the case if you're in California and trying to call New York and telling New York what to do. That might be different. We see it all the time, but I can tell you, just being in our office, we listen to what our constituents have to tell, and I've seen that happen through our different offices. So that's one. Just adding a little bit to what Melissa said, in terms of movement building, I think one of the things that is really important about movement building is that it creates relationships. It creates that interconnectivity that we're talking about. So I can tell you, like I said, I usually work in New York. I'm currently in Texas. The political landscape in New York and Texas are completely different. And so it's been interesting to me, just to say the least. So here, my mom has friends who are Trump supporters. And it's been incredible to me that, but there are older people who need vaccines. So I've taken it upon myself to make sure that they get connected to that, because even they were disconnected. They were not getting the services that they needed. And so I knew that I couldn't really see eye to eye with them on everything else. But I'm like, let me create that relationship. So I've now created plenty of those relationships with our network of seniors. And now that, now that we have created that relationship, that allows you to take it to the next level. Now we can have a conversation. Now we have something in common. Now we have something where okay, we see each other like, oh, human beings. I'm here to help you. Let's figure out how we can work together. So relationship building is really important, and that's part of movement building.
I would absolutely echo and co-sign that. I think the relationships are so important. I'll also confess that one of my nerdy little obsessions is how do you talk about these issues in ways that are going to build more support and more consensus? And so there's great research by folks like Anat Shenker-Osorio and Ian Haney-Lopez, who helped develop the race-class narrative. And I wonder how some of those lessons might be applied in these spaces as well, right? Where you talk about the kind of high-level shared values. And then you talk explicitly about the fact that some people don't want to see these sorts of policies advance, and why. What is strategic about racism? What is strategic about gender discrimination, right? And then kind of talk about the fact that we have won these sorts of fights before and we can continue to win them. So I think there is something to be said both for the kind of relationship building and the base building, which of course is the hugely important foundation on which all this is based. And then also combining that with thinking about how we should be talking about these in order to kind of win folks over. And again, to Melissa's point, not necessarily the furthest right-leaning, most extremist folks, but the people who can be reached through relationship, who are kind of open to these messages.
I think the other thing that I think all of you know is that, everybody has something that, frankly, my generation didn't have when we were starting out, which is you all have your own bully pulpit through social media. And that also comes with responsibility. It comes with responsibility to, continue to lift up the good ideas, to lift up the elected leaders who were on the front lines doing the work, to make sure that there's a civil discourse, but it's one that is based on the principles of equity and justice. And so I think, don't be shy about using your voice and your power. You're all privileged by the fact that you're on this, you're probably a law student or a lawyer, you're a highly educated person, but many of you may be the first in your family to be so. I'm the first in my family, grew up in modest means in a small town in Maine. And I think part of it is just, owning your power and using it.
So one of our audience asked, could Melissa elaborate on her point about the tax code as a social document? That's a wonderful question, and any of you should feel free to chime in. Melissa, what do you think?
I love
What
this
did you mean?
question so much. This is like, I get to nerd out on the tax code. Yeah. So there's a couple of different ways we've explored this concept of the tax code as a social document. One is the ways in which gender and racial discrimination is written directly into the tax code because of assumptions that we've made about who is doing certain activities and which activities like caregiving are valuable. And so one example of this is if you are have personal injury at work that's a physical injury and you get an award, that is not taxed. But if you are experience sexual harassment, which is predominantly experienced by women, that's another form of injury, that is taxed. And so that's like a small example, like fixing that isn't going to fix the tax code, but you can use it as an example of the way that the different experiences that men and women have and the value we place on those experiences are reflected in what we consider economically valuable or not. And the tax code is one example of that. Another piece is how we use the tax code to expand or to mitigate racial and gender wealth gaps. And so, for example, a lot of what we call tax expenditures are like the mortgage interest deduction or thinking about tax benefits for retirement savings. These predominantly go to people who are at the top of the income spectrum because they have the tax liability to benefit from them, or they have the ability to purchase a home that then gets them the mortgage interest deduction. But then when it comes to rental assistance, or when it comes to making sure that lower income people can build savings for retirement, all of a sudden deficits, we got to worry about the deficit. And so it's really thinking about how we use the tax code to, in some cases, make the wealthy wealthier, and at the same time, deprive the Treasury of the revenue that it needs to make public investments to give people a leg up. I could go on and on about examples there. And then finally, there are examples of places where the tax code is really important in advancing racial and gender equity. So that's things, for example, like the child tax credit or the earned income tax credit, which have enormous poverty fighting impacts. And in fact, there's been analysis showing that the Biden plan on the child tax credit could cut and related provisions could cut child poverty in half. And to this point, we have excluded the lowest income earners, disproportionately Black and brown single mothers, from the full benefit of the child tax credit. Biden's plan would reverse that. And so there are opportunities with each of these tax fights to advance or to take us backwards in terms of racial and gender equity. And so that's what I mean when I say the tax code is a social document. And yes,
just to add one more thing.
Yeah.
To add one more thing to that, when we see it with immigrants, you see a lot of immigrants paying taxes. There's specific actual number that is given to them. If they don't have a social security number, they have what's called the ITIN, the tax identification number. And even though they're paying taxes, like I mentioned earlier, many times we exclude them from the social benefits that everybody else gets.
yes. Hell yeah.
Thank you. So in my memory, Republicans supported all the earlier Voting Rights Act unanimously in the House and by overwhelming majority in the Senate. Republicans under Nixon proposed the first comprehensive income support program for to replace welfare. That didn't happen, largely because of opposition from Southern Democrats. My question is this: I know that Republican values have historically supported gender equality, reproductive freedom. They were the leaders in reproductive freedom until after Roe v. Wade. They've supported racial equality in ways that Democrats couldn't because they were divided. How do we help the Republican Party to find its roots? Anybody? That was not on our list of questions.
I mean, make white supremacy.
Right. It's really at this stage. I mean, we're laughing. I think we're laughing to keep from crying because we're in such a bad state now because the Republican Party has totally kind of conceded to the white supremacist and white nationalist aspects of its base. I mean, I honestly don't know what more to say about that. I mean, I think, yeah, I think it's really one of these probably clearest examples of how strategic racism is just distorting our politics and leading to horrible outcomes for everyone, so that you see a party who has many people in its base who actually want certain benefits is completely disconnected from that because they'd rather chase the support of folks who they need to keep aggrieved and angry. And it's just, I think it's appalling. I have to confess, I don't have the solution.
Voting rights, filibuster reform. I mean, there's a whole range of, I think, democratic reforms, because part of the strategy has been to keep as many people as possible, particularly young people, Black people, students, Latinos. Like the strategy has been to keep people from getting the right or being able to exercise their right to vote. And if you're basing your strategy on getting as few people to vote as possible, then you have to examine what your platform is.
Well, thank goodness we have the next panel on voting, because we have not come up with the answer to this question. We've identified it as a key problem. But we're kind of stuck there, huh? Well, we wanted to talk
movement building.
Movement building. Yeah, we wanted to talk most broadly about our vision of if you could write the omnibus bill that addressed the lessons that we've learned from the pandemic in terms of the caregiving work, what would it say? Maybe it's not any possible because it's all in the weeds.
There's a new coalition out there called Make Care Count.
Uh-huh.
I think that tagline says it. You make the invisible visible and you value it. And you put Black and brown women at the center of it. And I could get into like what that looks like across 20 policies, but if Black and brown women are doing well, everyone is doing well. And I think that that's what it comes down to. And so if we're looking at a policy through those, then all of us are going to benefit. But we need to be leading with that population. Make care count.
Make Care Count as a coalition to adopt the visionary response to the lack of respect for caregiving revealed by the pandemic.
Yeah, so to piggyback on what Melissa said, what I would say is really needed, and I think we've been all saying it in different ways, is just the reprioritization and really putting our values on what really is important. And so by what Melissa just mentioned, that campaign, that's what it does, right? So instead of focusing on the top whatever percent, we're really focusing on the people who are doing, again, essential workers, the people who are really getting us moving. And when you do that, that's when you're able to really move us away from where we are. So, if you want very specific policies, universal basic income, universal child care, Medicare for all, legalization of immigrants. It was mentioned earlier by Anne, national paid leave, medical leave. So there's a lot of programs that are needed, but when do you bring those programs is when you are really focusing on the people who are really moving our economy and not just on certain private interests.
Thank you, that was helpful. I think we have come to the end of our time. Is that right?
Yes, we were told that we had to wrap it up.
Anybody have a final comment?
Just
Well,
to
thank you.
This was a great discussion and really appreciate everybody's perspective. And I think, what I through is that it's these conversations, it's these relationships, it's these ability to continue to work and network and make our collective voices known and our collective work lift up that will continue this. So I really appreciate I did not know Brittany or Maribel before this. So really great to meet both of you.
Great to meet all of you. You're all awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.